Welcome back to Askewed Reviews, and we are continuing the Fast and Furious franchise because around this time of year it's all about family. And so today we are doing the 2019 film Fast and Furious Presents Hobbs and Shaw. Here is your trivia question for today. Brixton calls himself the black version of what fictional character? The answer will be at the end of this episode. So, at the beginning of this film, it's been around 2 years since the events of The Fate of the Furious. We are soon introduced to one of our newest characters, Hattie, who happens to be an MI6 agent, and her, along with her team, are trying to get their hands on a programmable super virus. Unfortunately for them, there's another individual named Brixton who is also trying to get his hands on the programmable virus as well. And he seems to be pretty well skilled at what he can do. So, in a last ditch effort to make sure that Brixton can't get his hands on this programmable virus, Hattie injects it into herself and then flees. We then hop over to some familiar faces as we get to see what the daily lives of both Hobbs and Shaw are like nowadays. So, both Hobbs and Shaw are pulled in for the mission to try and find Hattie. They are not happy about the fact that apparently they are supposed to work together. They decide to, of course, at the beginning, go their own separate ways to try and find her. Hobbs ends up running into her first, and after a little bit of an altercation, does manage to convince her to come in. It's here where we discover that Hattie is actually the sister of Deckard Shaw. Now, they made it extremely obvious from the beginning of the movie, but let's act surprised. So now Hobbs, Shaw, and Hattie are all going to have to work together to not only stop Brixton, but manage to extract the super virus from Hattie. However, though, stopping Brixton might not be as easy as they had hoped, as not only does he have a small army, but he works for a super secret organization, and apparently they've been souping him up with different types of biotechnology. So, will Hobbs and Shaw actually be able to work together? And will Hattie be able to keep them from killing each other while keeping herself alive? This movie was directed by David Leitch. He also managed to sneak in a little cameo for himself as one of the helicopter pilots. Shane Black was also a possibility of director for this film. This movie was filmed in England, Scotland, California, and Hawaii. Vanessa Kirby was a new addition to the Fast and Furious series as the character of Hattie. I honestly thought she did a great job. Here's something, though, that I find funny. There's supposed to be about only a 2 year difference between Deckard and Hattie, when in real life, there's a 21-year difference between Jason Statham and Vanessa Kirby. Idris Elba was brought in to play the character of Brixton, and in my opinion, he also did a great job. Now, here's something funny you may or may not have noticed, is on Brixton's chest, there is actually a logo, and it happens to look very similar to the Wayland Yutani logo. So I wonder if there's a possibility that this world and the world of Alien actually exist in the same universe. And if you didn't know, Idris Elba actually did work for Wayland Yutani when he appeared in the movie Prometheus. Something else about Brixton you may not have noticed is when he rides his motorcycle and it changes shape, it actually makes the sound of a transformer transforming. Cliff Curtis plays the role of Hobbs's brother, Jonah, but that role almost went to Jason Momoa. Unfortunately, the timing didn't work out, but as we all know, Momoa did come back to the Fast series as he was the main villain in Fast X. One of Dwayne Johnson's common collaborators, Kevin Hart, shows up as a cameo in this film as Air Marshal Dinkley. Ryan Reynolds also appears in the film as the character of Locke. But did you happen to know he also is the distorted voice for the director of Eden? Now, if they eventually go into having Locke actually being the leader of that could be interesting. But at least at the beginning, there wasn't a plan to do it that way. They just had Reynolds do the voice. In fact, there were plans to actually bring in Keanu Reeves to be the director and even make a brief appearance in this film, but scheduling did not work out that way. They may, however, bring him back if they ever do the sequel. Here's a random little cameo. The French bulldog near the beginning of the film is actually Dwayne Johnson's real-life dog, who he actually named Hobbs. Johnson's real-life cousin also makes a cameo as Mateo. This is Joe Anoa'i, which you also may know him much better as the wrestler Roman Reigns. Also, when speaking about wrestling, here's a couple other things you may or may not have noticed. Did you realize that Dwayne Johnson and his father Rocky Johnson, who is also a professional wrestler, appear as the actual family photo for Hobbs? Johnson does his famous eyebrow raise that he's well known for from his wrestling career, and he even uses two catchphrases from two other wrestlers. At one point, he says, "Open up a can of whoop ass," which is from Stone Cold Steve Austin, and he calls someone an ass clown, which is something famously done by Chris Jericho. He even partially uses one of his own catchphrases when he tells Shaw that he's going to take that chair, turn that sumbitch sideways, and stick it down his throat. There's a moment in the film where Shaw says, "There's things I've done that I have to make amends for." It is believed that he is referring to what he did to Han. There's also another interesting line that Shaw has in the film, where when looking for a car, he sees a Mini Cooper, and he mentions that he had one just like that in Italy. This is more than likely a reference to Statham being in the film The Italian Job, which famously used Mini Coopers. The headquarters for Eaton was actually the McLaren Technology Center. There have been actual talks of doing a somewhat sequel to this film, where it would actually bridge the gap between Fast X and Fast 11, and supposedly it would be called Hobbs and Reyes, explaining now what is happening between his character and Jason Momoa's. And now it's time for the family counter. The word family is used in this film 15 times, once by Sam, 5 times by Hobbs, 3 times by Shaw, twice by Jonah, twice by Hattie, once by Safina, and once by Locke. So when it comes to the film Fast and Furious presents Hobbs and Shaw, I like this movie, but I feel it kind of went down just a little bit from some of the previous Fast and Furious films. I absolutely love the chemistry between Johnson and Statham, and I think that both Kirby and Elba also did great jobs, but I don't know, there was just something lacking. So I think I'm going to give this one a 3 out of 5. Now, as for the trivia question from the beginning of this episode, Brixton calls himself the black version of what fictional character? So in the film, Brixton calls himself Black Superman, but that's not what the original line was. That was actually ad-libbed by Idris Elba. The original line was calling himself Black James Bond. The reason why he didn't is because Elba was actually up for the role of James Bond and just didn't feel right about doing that. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Askewed Reviews, and if there's a movie you'd like to see get a review, just mention it in the comments.